Good evening, I'm Brian Stewart, and welcome to the Schoolhouse's fall season's final Speaker's Corner. The topic, climate literacy, is an extraordinarily critical topic right now, such turbulent times, right in the midst of the most giant pandemic of modern times, and climate change, arguably the most complex and globally threatening crisis of our time. We know international movements are bringing climate dangers to the fore. Media are covering it. Governments are meeting and economists are wringing their hands. And most of our population is convinced of the threat to their futures. But studies also show we're not as aware as we think we are. We need much more education about the problem at all levels. A huge task for our schools. Well, there's a consensus about the human cause. Not everyone's on side yet. There is foot dragging. So ensuring our society becomes climate literate is a super large challenge for educators and students. Tonight, our panel, two educators and a student active in the field, will discuss what the education system is doing now and how they see the struggle ahead to reach the kind of awareness that this society needs of so complex a subject. What advances are most urgent and where breakthroughs may soon occur. After a brief intro, I'll ask each to give a short account of their activities in climate education and the goals ahead. First, Ellen Field teaches at Lakehead University and is one of the country's leading research analysts in climate change education in Canada. She's very involved with a wide range of ministries and school boards to help galvanize greater urgency in this field. Next, Hilary Inwood teaches and leads efforts in environment and sustainability education at the University of Toronto. Also a researcher and artist using outdoor art projects as part of climate education. And Bilal Bartaai is a senior student deeply involved in environment and climate studies at Mark Garneau Collegiate Institute. At a time of rising student activism, he's pushing for greater awareness as president of the Toronto Youth Environmental Council. Well, first, Ellen Field, I'd like to go to you because you've been looking at a broad survey and research and you've been sort of leading into what attitudes really are in this country and how we really think about the crisis.
Great, thanks, Brian. Let me just share my screen quickly. And I'll do a quick overview of some of the research. And I'd first like to just say thanks for the invitation to speak this evening. And I also would like to just posit that it's really important for us to recognize Indigenous ways of knowing and being. And if we posited and if we put forward a lot of the dominant laws of Indigenous cultures, we really wouldn't be in our current climate emergency. So to just walk us through a bit of the research that I've been doing, I'll share 3 research projects and I'll try to go through them quickly. So the first one is actually from my postdoc research study and it's up on the screen and it's called Canada Climate Change and Education, Opportunities for Public and Formal Education. And this research resulted in establishing several benchmarks of climate change education in Canada. And it was a large study that surveyed over 3,000 Canadians, including 1,200 teachers, 500 parents, 500 youth grades 7 to 12, and over 1,000 members of the general public. And the youth segment of being from grade 7 to 12 is the first time that this population has actually been surveyed on scale. Often youth surveys look at 18 to 24-year-olds. The survey identified that overall Canadians are concerned, as Brian mentioned, recognize that climate change is happening, but are less sure of the anthropogenic causes of climate change. And there are several big gaps that came up in the research. One is the certainty that carbon dioxide and other greenhouse gases cause climate change. In the study, we found only 48% of Canadians correctly identified these greenhouse gases as primary causes. The second data point I think that's important to sort of highlight is the recognition of how much heating the Earth system can tolerate. And only 43% of Canadians could correctly identify 1 to 2 degrees, but 42% identified that they weren't sure how much. And so those were two of the sort of knowledge questions that I think are important to highlight. And in terms of education, it was very clear from the survey that Canadians predominantly get climate change information from television news. So the media has a really big role to play here. And I will also just say that these findings are from early 2019, and a lot has really changed, both in media reporting as well as public awareness around climate change. So a newer survey is currently underway, and we need to see sort of where things are at now. Also, I'll just mention that a report out this week, Climate Coverage in Canada, showed that large majorities of climate scientists, journalists, and the public strongly agree there is a climate crisis and that news media should report on it as a crisis. So shifts in thinking about how education works in that space. When it comes to formal education, coming back to the survey, Canadians and educators agree that more should be done to educate young people about climate change. There is really limited class time that is spent on climate change content. About a third of teachers that we sampled reported teaching any climate change. And for teachers who do, it tends to be 1 to 10 hours of instruction per year. So again, things may have changed since 2019, but still that's incredibly low for the importance of the issue. As well, it's important that we don't blame teachers. Only a third of the teachers indicated that they feel the knowledge and skills to teach climate change, so that requires professional development. And from this as well, students are a key group to target with climate change education and action. And so we analyzed several responses from students to look at that segment in terms of how empowered they are. And 46% of students aged 12 to 18 are what we call aware for this analysis. And aware means that they understand that human-caused climate change is happening, but they do not believe that human efforts will be effective, which is where I think our education needs to shift, is really look at that solutions and action orientation. I'll just quickly walk through another research project that is currently under review, where we systematically looked at every curriculum policy document for every province and looked at where those climate change expectations occur, and really found that there's piecemeal coverage that's not consistent. Right now, this is the overview. We then parsed out the data to look at what's mandatory versus an elective, and it really starts to shift in terms of what that student experience is, unless they're selecting those elective environmental science courses or et cetera in the grade 11, 12. The other highlight of this data I'd like to just point out is we looked at the curriculum in terms of its action orientation to see if it is involved in students taking action, and predominantly it's focused on understanding climate impacts and maybe some critical thinking or analysis. Only 13% actually suggest getting actively involved. And the last piece of research that I'd just like to highlight is a new book chapter that Paul Berger and a grad student and I have put together, and is coming out next month. It's really looking at key themes that formal education can learn from the youth climate justice movement. And so we put forward a framework around how we can think about learning from this very powerful social movement and some of the impacts that it's had. And we put forward this framework, and I'll just list them. So really, justice and equity orientation is central to how we think about climate change education. Leadership and fostering student efficacy over focusing so much on knowledge content of climate impacts, as well as really shifting our sense of what activism is, recognizing the importance of being active in this crucial moment in time, as well as this interdisciplinary and action-oriented approach as being essential to mitigate climate anxiety, and that speaks to attending to youth well-being. So with that, I will stop talking about research and hand it over to another panelist.
All right, Hilary, how about yourself now? Projects you're involved in.
Thank you so much, Brian. I so deeply appreciate the research that Ellen has been doing in this field. It's really needed in Canada. It's needed worldwide, and there's no way that we can truly get to a state of climate literacy without the research to inform how we move forward. I also want to give a shout out to Bilal, because Bilal's doing the research, but with youth on the ground. So we know that Bilal is still in secondary school, and it's impressive what they've been able to do in terms of a more practically oriented research as well. So I've been bringing this work to around climate change education, and it goes by many terms, just to be fair. We've been calling it environmental and sustainability education at OISE for many years, and I see direct connections between the two, to be fair. All of the needs that and the gaps in what we've been doing in education so far, as Ellen has pointed out, is contingent on getting teachers up to speed to doing this work in their own classrooms. So we have been doing this work at OISE since about 2008, and like Ellen, I'm just going to share a couple of slides. We've been doing this work since 2008 at OISE, trying to introduce in our very large teacher education program, introduce this work to what we call pre-service teachers, people who are training to be teachers for K-12 education. And we figured that's a great time to connect with them and get them excited about the possibilities of doing this work in their classroom. Because it's not like you can drone on to children and youth about climate crisis. We know categorically that does not work in terms of engaging them in understanding more about what's happening to climate change and to the current climate crisis that we find ourselves in. Instead, what we need to do is change the way that we're teaching altogether. So we've been working on that, and we've been doing that through doing programming for pre-service, what we call teacher candidates, for those training to be teachers. We started it doing extracurricular learning, so doing it outside of their formal classes. We've moved it now into their classes, both as elective and core courses. We've set up internships with all sorts of wonderful organizations. I noticed that Sunday Harrison is in the room, and she's very willingly taken students from our program to learn more with her organization of Green Thumbs Growing Kids, which is a fabulous group here in Toronto. We've offered courses and we run all sorts of sustainability related campaigns, and sometimes they take unusual forms. So Brian, you kindly introduced me as an artist. I would say a practicing rather than a professional artist, and that I'm practicing all the time. And one of the ways that we have tried to manifest this in the building is getting our students, our staff, and our faculty involved in actually creating environmentally themed art installations. We've got about 14 of them in the building now. So, climate literacy can manifest in lots of different ways. And certainly, as one of Ellen's graphs pointed out, we absolutely need to be taking this into every subject area. And one of my subject specialties is actually visual arts education. So bringing climate literacy, yes, into art education is not only possible, but it's a really great way to not only help people develop their knowledge in this area, but also we've discovered through also doing research studies to shift their behavior towards sustainability, which is really fantastic too. We also do it through educational gardening at OISE. We have a very small, but I like to say a very powerful educational garden. This mimics the educational garden movement that was started by Evergreen in this country and is supported deeply in the Toronto District School Board here in Toronto, using educational gardening as a way into helping children not only understand about the ecosystems to which all of us as humans are completely embedded and part of, but also helping them to understand that a lot of the keys to how we can move forward in terms of developing climate literacy can actually be connected to food systems, to habitat, to biodiversity. So all of these things are interconnected. They really are very hard to separate out. We've been working on bringing this work around climate literacy into teacher education more generally. And we've been doing that with our partners at the Toronto District School Board. I noticed that David Hawker-Bodlowski is in the audience today. And David has been central to this work, along with many other educators, Pam Miller, Richard Christie, Eleanor Dudar over the years. And so connecting our new teachers, these teachers who are being trained right now, to existing teachers who are doing amazing work in climate change education is a really important part of the puzzle. So that's what you're seeing on the left, are practicing teachers learning alongside our teacher candidates, those who are training to be teachers. And then what we're seeing that happen is that spins out. So as our teacher candidates, you're seeing a bunch of them here in the back of the photo on the right-hand side, going out into schools, and they're taking it with them. So they're doing this work then with the students that they work with in Practica, which is fabulous. They're really learning how to do this work from the very beginning of their career and learning how incredible it is to embed it right into your teaching practice, not as a tack on, but as a really core element of how and what you teach both children and youth. I just want to give a highlight to a special collaboration we have with the TDSB. It was begun in 2017, and I think we're doing something really unique. We're bringing together practicing teachers with new teachers to help both up the game when it comes to climate change education. And it's proving to be a really rich site for research, in fact. And it's just been a really fantastic way for us to understand all of the different aspects, in fact, that Ellen finished off talking about, how we weave both climate change education and environmental and sustainability education into eco-justice, into Indigenous ways of knowing, into youth engagement and activism. All of these components are really important aspects of the work that we've been doing at OISE.
Great. Bilal, you've been very active. Tell us about it.
Thank you, Brian, and thank you, Hilary and Ellen, for your piece. So as I was already introduced, I am the president of the Toronto Youth Environmental Council for this year. And I guess I could just walk you guys through some of the things, some of our core values, some of the things that we've done in the past, and basically kind of what our mission is for the next couple of years and just what our efforts are generally for. So obviously the youth have been pretty involved in the climate justice movement. I think we've seen them in all different pieces of media. We've seen, you know, Greta Thunberg, who's at probably the forefront of the youth climate justice movement at the moment. But apart from her, we've seen so many other different youth just taking that lead in their communities, in their cities, in their countries, and just making sure that the voices of the youth are heard in terms of what it is that we're thinking specifically when it comes to the current climate crisis that we're in. So in TIAC, last year at least, our mission was basically about awareness. We wanted to start small because it was the first time that we were actually, most of us in that team were generally diving into what youth climate action looked like. And so we started off small just by doing things that kind of connected to youth and resonated with people our age. So we were doing social media challenges. We were getting youth to send us their artwork, send us their photography, send us their poetry that correlated to the environment. So those were like really small actions. And then we kind of realized that there was so much potential that we could use, that there was so much untapped potential in youth for the Youth Climate Justice Act or the Youth Climate Justice Movement. And so this year, what our main focus is change. What we want to do this year is make sure that when our voices are heard, it's not coming in one year and going out the other, right? It's staying in there, we're getting change, or change is happening. And, you know, we're in those seats where people who make important decisions, people who actually have a huge role in the climate crisis are listening to us and hearing what we have to say. And this also connects to what Hilary and Ellen have been saying about teachers and classrooms and education. It also speaks to people in the board. What is it that youth can do in their classrooms that will just take the youth climate justice movement that much further, right? And so that's kind of what we're focusing on this year. Because last year we were doing conferences, we were doing different climate action challenges for students across the board. And we believe that's great, but we also believe that actual change, tangible change needs to be taken if we want to see genuine progress in the climate action movement. So that's basically a very quick and shortened telling of what TIAC is all about. Brian, back to you.
Okay, that's very interesting. You know, you get a sense from all of you that this is an enormously wide front you're advancing on. So many areas of education and society have to get involved. And the youth movement out there is certainly putting a kind of momentum driving force that's getting media attention, government attention, political attention across the board. But I wonder if one of the things that I really think people are not fully grasping yet, but the youth do, and that is time is not on their side. when we talk about the future risk, the future goals we have to reach, we're thinking, oh, well, the 2030, 2040, somewhere down the road. A lot of people might have that attitude. But this is a very short time that the education system has to really have a national and international effect here. Anyone can jump in on this. Wants to speak on that. The time element that we have to wake up about.
And Brian, I would say this is one of our greatest challenges in Canada because we have a decentralized education system where each province and territory has their own mandate for education. We see a really wide variety of responses across the country to how both environmental and sustainability education and climate change education is being brought into, whether it's K-12 schools or into higher education. And it's hugely problematic. In other countries around the world, there has been a central mandate given by a federal or a national government and by a national ministry of education to change things, and change can happen moderately quickly. But in Canada, it is a very slow pace of change because every region is taking their own route into the work. And as political groups change, every time a premier changes in a province in Canada, we find that that has a ripple effect into how climate change education is being done and mandated.
Ellen, you find it, sorry, go ahead, the time element, the
yeah,
time.
so I feel like education is generally, because of the federated system and the various mechanisms, it does take time to change curriculum policy, all of those pieces. And so there is this need for ambitious leadership. There's a need to see what the science is saying, be in a leadership position and make those hard administrative calls. And that's where I think, as you were saying, like the pressure from the youth climate movement as well as the strikes are so powerful in terms of saying, no, we need action now. And there is a group in British Columbia called Climate Education Reform BC. They are a group of 25 youth who actually 3 weeks ago met with the Minister of Education. They're incredibly organized. I would give them direct entry into our Masters of Ed program. In terms of the background research that they've done, in terms of thinking about what is needed in curriculum reform, the consultation mechanisms, as well as the content that they see needs to be put on the table. They're incredibly inspiring. And I think, based on what I've seen with that group and the ability that they've had, there is some mechanism there that I feel like BC may be the first in Canada in terms of coming forward with a mandatory climate change curriculum. However, I will say that in our research of the various curriculum policies for each province, what we did notice is BC has actually moved to what we call a competency-based curriculum. And there's an irony in this, in that before it was something called content descriptors. So it was more like what the knowledge that a student needed to have rather than like the skills or the competencies. And our project went on for long enough that we actually reviewed the old curriculum, and there was actually more climate change expectations in that old curriculum. The new one is the way to go because it's process-based. It lends itself to more action orientation, but it requires teachers to have the knowledge to link to the big ideas and to see how to tie their teaching. But what I found really hopeful is Nova Scotia is being mentored by British Columbia and is moving their curriculum through that process. And in their new curriculum, almost all of the expectations they have are now mandatory. So and New Brunswick is going through the same process. And again, their expectations were the higher. BC, Nova Scotia, and New Brunswick had the most mandatory expectations of curriculum. So we are seeing some response in terms of these updates. However, I feel like the other piece to all of this is we now coming out of COP26, where fossil fuels have been named as the main driver in policy. Curriculum goes nowhere near that in terms of what climate change education is taught. In the grade 10 climate change unit in Ontario, one of the closest places, and it actually uses, I think, the language of evaluate a popular hypothesis of what's causing climate change. So there's big need to really evaluate what are those core pieces of information that we're teaching in climate change education in our curriculum documents.
Bilal, I'll be interested in your view. You're obviously following the news very closely about movements across the world and the enormous media attention they're now getting. Because time is short, this question should be asked. I mean, can you maintain, do you think, that public interest? Can you maintain that kind of forward momentum? Or does this, as some movements in the past have experienced, tend to fade out a bit as the subject drops from the news for a while?
Well, Brian, I think people my age at least are the most aware of just how much time is passing. You know, every other week we seem to have a deadline that just comes way too fast. And taking that perspective into I think a grander, basically in the grander context, I think there once was this idea that when people my age come into power and, you know, grow older, start taking these important positions, that's when everything will be okay. And I think we've quickly realized that we do not have that amount of time to wait. Basically, there's so much time left for all of Gen Z to be in positions of power. And the amount of time that will take is is way too long, way past what you might call the due date of when we need to take action. And so I think that's why so many of these youth climate movements have taken spark, have gone aflame and ablaze, because we understand that there's so little time left for us to really make any meaningful change. And if that time isn't hit soon enough, or as in if we don't do enough change by that due date, then we're in a point of no return. We've heard that term used a lot in, I guess, climate justice or when talking about the climate crisis. And I think it's definitely true. And so albeit a lot of youth justice movements will probably not gain as much attention when the media stops focusing on them, honestly, I do believe that even though media plays such a huge part, there's also another huge part, which is social media, which is just general youth interests. When you look at youth movements, a lot of them are brought to the forefront not by, news anchors or broadcast channels, bringing them up, but rather just their social media efforts, just, other youth interested and aware of what's going on, uplifting these voices and making sure that their opinions are also heard. And so to basically circle back to your answer or question, I think we're hyper aware of time, and I don't think these movements are going anywhere anytime soon.
And I would argue that, in fact, this student voice in bringing about educational change in a timely fashion is incredibly important. Working in a higher education institute, I can tell you that our administrative and managerial leaders listen more closely to youth and to students in our institute than they do often to faculty and to staff. So Bilal, I would encourage you to not only bring about change sort of from a bottom up, if you will, structure, because sadly, and I do say sadly, students are often seen as the bottom of the education pyramid. But I would argue that we need, yes, the policy changes that Ellen was just arguing for, and we need youth to be pushing their teachers to do this work in classrooms, because the reality is the policy is fantastic to have in place, and it should be in place. There's no doubt about that. It's long overdue, particularly here in Ontario. But teachers don't need anybody's permission to do this work in their classrooms. We have a lot of flexibility in Ontario classrooms in terms of what we can and can't do as educators. And so teachers can decide that this is important, and they can weave it into every single subject that they teach in every single grade level. I actually just had a fascinating conversation this afternoon with an ECE, an early childhood educator who works in a kindergarten classroom here in Toronto, and she's trying to figure out how to bring climate change education to her students in age-appropriate ways. That's not written into the kindergarten curriculum in Ontario, but there's nothing stopping her from doing that because of the flexibility inherent in the curriculum. So we all need to make decisions about how we're going to do this work and how we implement this in a really timely fashion.
Just before I go to the next question, which is to pick up on your point about we can start really young, and it's very important that we do. You'll notice the questions are invited. As you have a question, put it in an appropriate box below, and I'll be bringing as many questions as I can into the discussion shortly. But I am interested in this whole bit, though. But okay, we have urgency that has to be grasped. We have a fragmented system across Canada that's going to be very difficult to mold together and bring together as a core. But we sort of we do have a lot of flexibility as well. Teachers can start their own project. How young can you start? How usefully can the subject as complex as global warming, climate change, environmental degradation, how early can that be brought into the education system usefully, do you think? Anyone can answer this.
Sure, maybe I'll take a stab at this and then others can join in. As Hilary was saying with an ECE teacher, exploring sort of what that looks like in terms of climate change education. Last year in my grad class on climate change education, I also had a kindergarten teacher, very experienced kindergarten teacher who was really looking at, as we were looking at the theory and the pedagogy and starting to translate that into what it would look like in her practice. And there's definitely other early years teachers who are exploring what this looks like and really moving from a place of approaching it with a student-centered mindset and also allowing for children to ask the questions in the language that they understand. And then also find answers to it in ways that are appropriate to them developmentally. And I sometimes think about it as like electricity. Electricity is actually a fairly complex topic in terms of transmission, generation, transmission, all of those steps. But yet if you ask a young child about electricity, they're going to tell you they know what it is. And climate change is very much similar. They've heard about it. They've seen something on the news. And so researchers also around climate anxiety are really talking around, if we don't include young children in the conversation in their school environments, we're actually doing them a disservice and we're creating dissonance in their lives because they are still hearing it. And if we don't provide those avenues in school to actually talk about it, normalize our emotions, provide some space to even enter the conversation, then we're really excluding them. And that also perpetuates the type of anxiety that they can have. And so even young children can have climate anxiety, which as parents, I have a 5.5-year-old, and I know that she thinks about this. So I think it's important that we include young children, and we do it also in developmentally appropriate ways. So I'm not saying, we sit down with a news file with, especially the news because of the ways that it sensationalizes at times. The images are very terrifying. And so we really need to think about the young learner and being student-centered in how we approach it.
I want to pick up on that point about anxiety. I'm the generation that lived through the early Cold War, where we were very, very anxious at times about the possibility that our future might be measured in days, not decades. But we didn't have teachers really who would talk about it much. It was kind of teachers in school were not supposed to delve into the political area very much or be terribly controversial. So I think a lot of us lived for a long period of time with anxiety. Bilal, your generation seems much less inclined to live in such a way. They're anxious. They have things to be very anxious about, but they want action now and very quickly. But how serious is that question of youth anxiety at the moment? Basic fear about the future.
Sure. A common trend I think I've seen among people my age is this sort of nihilism about the climate action movement. So when it comes to rally and fighting, we're all ramped up. But when it comes to actually thinking about the future, I think none of us really register it as well as we should be, right? So I think although some of us live in anxiety about how we could possibly live in a completely desolate earth in the next 20 years, Most of us are much more in the moment, or I guess if we want a positive outlook, optimistic about the future. We think that if we continue to rally for change and we continue to voice our opinions on different motions, different policies, make sure that people are hearing us and make sure that people understand that change is needed right now, we believe that we don't need to worry about the future. So I think that there's always this certain level of anxiety, and also we were generally born into it, right? We were kind of born into this conversation about climate action. We knew it as global warming a couple of years ago. Now we know it as climate change, which is a better term for it. But I wouldn't say that necessarily a lot of us are anxious, simply because I think we still believe that there is things to be done and that we can still change the tides if we act fast enough.
And there seems to be, there's general consensus, we are dealing with a subject of mind-boggling complexity. But in the younger generation today, teachers will certainly have seen this, seem somehow, how do I express this, mentally capable of handling complexity, perhaps a lot better than we could 30, 40 years ago. Is the system much more ready today, perhaps, to tangle with something of such extreme complexity as climate change? Because we live in a very complex world where the methods of communication are seemingly endless, and debate is constant, and facts and statistics and data are forever flowing through us like a giant tide. We're a little bit more up for a complex challenge than we may have been 30, 40 years ago. Anyone have a view on that?
Brian, in particular, I think one of the reasons that we are up for the complexity of the challenge now is because of a growing awareness that the way that education was presented to both parents and children and youth in the past as a sort of a monoculture, if you will, that there was one way to teach and that everybody should follow suit. That's changed rapidly, and it is continuing to change rapidly. That there's an understanding that the same teaching methods in the past that got us into this mess is not going to get us out of this mess moving forward. So in fact, what we need to do is broaden the way that we think about education and think about it as a more democratic enterprise that does let youth not only voice their concerns, their emotional concerns, their practical logistics of how we're going to move forward in a climate crisis era, but also to engage them in helping to figure out the solutions. We don't have all the answers as the educators. We're really in unprecedented territory. So what we need to do is really draw everybody into the conversation. Parents become part of that conversation. Of course, children and youth become active learners and contributors and activists. Bilal's a wonderful example of that. So it really is changing the conversation about how education is conducted. And there's lots of teachers not only rising to the challenge of learning new pedagogical approaches, but they're also modeling it for others. So we run an action research team of teachers in the Toronto District School Board who are really teacher researchers. They're using their classrooms as sort of mini laboratories, if you will, to test out ideas around nature-based learning, around outdoor learning, around eco-justice education, testing these out and then coming back and sharing what they've discovered with other teachers in the school board and with other educators outside of the school board. So those kinds of sort of collaborative approaches that the research isn't only done in universities, but it's done as partnerships between school boards and universities that invites students into the mix as co-researchers as well. All of this is really changing the conversation, the ways that we are approaching teaching and learning in K-12 classrooms and in higher education as well. And I think that's going to help move us towards some solutions about how education can help with these cultural shifts towards living more sustainably.
Well, I've been very struck through the Speaker's Corner series by the number of experiments that are going on all the time. More moving education. Sunday Harrison was telling us outdoors, getting students out of the classroom more, looking at nature more from the ground up, looking at Indigenous cultures more carefully and what they can teach. And there seems to be a sort of ferment of thought going through the educational system now. I kind of wish there'd be a kind of a national movement, or there'd be some coming together of a special think tank or something to bring it all together as a national sense. But still, we have to deal with what we have to deal with. And I want to ask you about foot dragging. There are in the system, of course, people who will argue, you're moving these students into politics here and there. You're just starting to question everything from the capitalist system down to whether we should have comfort goods and the rest of it. And perhaps you're not being blunt enough about the price everybody's going to have to pay for the sacrifices to be made. Does it concern you at all that there is a lot of speed bumps out there? I don't know what to term them actually, but problems of a political nature that this whole experiment may start running into, as we've seen, obviously, in the nation to ourselves.
I think if I can jump in, I think about it in some ways in terms of incrementalism. So thinking about how do we slowly move in an incremental way, and climate responses really need to be exponential, scalable. They're big things. And so we really need leadership that understands the urgency and the type of ambition. And so I think this is the crux of where we are at. But I do want to pick up as well on what Hilary was really talking about around these spaces of collaboration. And part of I think that is happening with motivated teachers, and also in some schools that are just really taking this on and responding, I would say, in a way that's responsive. They're thinking about what it means to be an educational institution in this moment in time. And beyond that, I think we are in this very elastic time period where, coming out of COVID, we have seen how interconnected our lives are around equity in a way that we maybe haven't had to experience quite as much previously. And so in our public conscious, I think we're seeing the interconnection of our economic systems to the environment, to our trade, all of these things. And so when we think about subjects in schools, my hope is that teachers are starting to make those connections across their subject areas. They're starting to think about issues as not siloed, but as they are in the world. And I think, coming as well back to what Bilal said around the importance of social media, which can be such a complicated space. However, when youth are not experiencing rich learning environments around climate, they're often going to these third spaces to engage with like-minded others or to get information. My PhD was actually in social media and environmental activism, and looking at how this third space works in these social movements. And then it led me to really try to crack the nut on what was happening in the formal education system, because what I was seeing happen in the social media spaces around climate was so inspiring. And so I think the more that we can also in education sort of broaden it, I know Hilary talked about this as well, but think about learning. We're in the 21st century. No longer is information a scarcity, it's everywhere, right? So we don't need to think about the fact that we need to hold all the answers. It's really about creating processes of engagement, of being critical, and even our leaders don't have all the answers on the climate crisis. This is fundamentally a learning issue and an issue of innovation and experimentation to really find our way out of it. And so the more we can be humble about what we know and don't know, and also recognize that we need to collectively learn and engage to get ourselves through this existential crisis.
I think the term alliances is terribly important. I've been noticing some of the comments and coverage coming out of the international conference in Glasgow. What seems to be promising in some areas are these new alliances of the willing. If you can't get every country on board, you can get 10 or 15 in an alliance with business, with students, with education, whatever, and try and make real advances in that one area. But where there is a possible alliance, you have to take it, and you have to go for it. I think, Bilal, you were talking about that too. The youth is seeing the possibility now, and indeed the necessity of more seeking alliances across the board here? Hello?
Oh, yes.
I'm
Sorry,
sorry. I
microphone
said
issues. No worries. Yeah, definitely. I think one thing that at least the Toronto Youth Environmental Council is thinking of moving forward is creating one of these alliances with, the city, right? So I think when it comes to policy and when it comes to emotions, sorry, there are so many that happen, and I feel like so many important stakeholders just aren't part of those conversations. And I believe a lot of people would echo that statement. And so what we're looking at going forward is to find a way to create an alliance with those people who do make these really important changes, whether it be policy in education, policy in environment, policy in transportation, all of these that connect somewhere to the environment and the climate crisis, where we could get people, whether it be youth, whether it be students in university, just anyone who would generally be affected by it and has a pretty good knowledge. As we've already talked about, so many youth today are much more knowledgeable about the climate crisis than I think a lot of people think, right? And so what we're trying to look at right now in terms of alliances is really just getting people in on those conversations, because trying to create policies and trying to create or trying to have conversations around certain issues when the people most greatly affected by these issues aren't present is kind of just talking without a in-person perspective. You're not really talking about what matters. You don't really understand what matters in these conversations. And so bringing these people in the forefront of these roundtables and these discussions, we believe is so important. And so that's why TIAC is like so on board for these alliances. And I think a lot of youth are in general, right? I think there's so many opportunities for alliances, as you already said, Brian, but not only at the national level, right? It could be at the municipal level. There could be alliances with youth and the provincial government, youth and universities, youth and education and boards. There are so many opportunities for alliances that would greatly change greatly help in terms of where the climate crisis or where the climate action movement is currently headed towards.
It's remarkable the broad range in which activity is taking place. I was reading recently about the youth justice movement, that youth at a remarkably young age now are taking legal action in. There's a whole element here of legal actions that may come into play as well. But one of the, I think, not essential, but one of the remarkable effects that education, children going to school and learning something like a danger to society or the future, is they take that discussion at home to their parents. And that parents across Canada will be inevitably affected by the students coming back from a system and trying to get them to take seriously a threat to their very futures, particularly their children's futures here. Does that really happen, or is it just in my imagination?
No, categorically.
Youth tends to propagandize.
No, categorically happening. We hear from both students and from their parents. As their parents come back in to talk to teachers as part of parent-teacher interviews, we hear categorically from parents that they've been learning about sustainability-related issues from their students, from their children, who might come home and admonish their parents for not separating out their recycling properly from the garbage, or not composting the kitchen waste, or not turning the lights off. So yeah, the patterns and the activities that we're introducing to children or school are absolutely migrating home with parents. I find it really interesting that David Suzuki's been very open about this, that he says he made a fundamental mistake at the beginning of his career, that he shouldn't have been targeting all of the work that he did over the years around climate to adults, that he should have been working with children, because his career has gone on so long now that in fact those children would now be well into their adult years had he started with them. And so he's realizing that all of the work that's being done is happening in education with the children and youth is the way to go, that to really bring them into an introduction around climate literacy from an early age, and then help them understand how to enact those forms of literacy as they get older, and really develop their sense of agency. I mean, Bilal's an excellent example of this. He's a really putting what he believes in to the test, not only through his volunteer work with TIAC, which is amazing, but he was just telling us before we started today that I hope this isn't breaking a secret, Bilal, that you're off to do more work as you head into university next year in environmental studies. Like, that's what we need. We need next generation who are going to take this work far more seriously and far more quickly, uptake it far more quickly than those of us did earlier in our upbringings.
I can quickly just add to the research piece, because it's very clear in the research. So Daniel Lawson in 2019's research study, actually, they had a full control as well as a treatment group, and then they measured the impact on the students as well as the parents with a climate change education intervention. And the most fascinating sort of finding that came out of it, this is in the US that she did this study, is that the effects were strongest among male parents and specifically conservative parents, and daughters appeared to be especially effective in influencing those conservative fathers. And so this is a really interesting sort of data piece that came forward in terms of that. And I know Earth Rangers in Canada also did a study last year, which also showed how parents' attitudinal positioning really shifted through the engagement of that program. So it's not just sort of urban myth or anything, Brian. The research really stands up around this. I did want to come back to this notion of young people and the time that we have and the urgency, and also just recognize that we really don't have time to, shift our education system and then wait for young people to graduate from this awesome education system and go on and change the world. We really need this multi-pronged approach where we have strong climate policy, where we are doing all of that work across our sectors. And at the same time, though, we're giving some focus to education and thinking about our education systems, because I think for too long, education has sort of been piecemeal in terms of what needs to happen at schools. And if you think about it from a policymaker's perspective, it's a lot easier to say, I'm going to spend X amount of $1 million for a large solar array or for energy efficient technologies, because you put that money in and then you can guarantee have this amount of greenhouse gas emission reductions. Education is a little trickier. It's in terms of the social process of learning. So you can put X amount of $1 million in, but because you're dealing with humans, and it's not a banking model where you can just put it in and then it's going to be complete behavior adaptation. It's difficult to fund in terms of that. And I think it has been really underfunded. It's been not considered as important as part of, a comprehensive national climate policy. But there is research that is also substantiated in Italy. They tried to sort of quantify it to say, if we scaled education to secondary students, what would that mean in terms of greenhouse gas emission savings? And their research did show that over a lifetime, it's on par with a solar array, with these other significant mitigation strategies. But it's hard in a policy context, I think, to make those claims that if you spend this amount of money on education, you're going to have for certain this amount of greenhouse gas reductions. So it becomes almost a moral and an ethical question to some degree. But if we transform schools, they can be significant players in terms of how we reach the emissions we need to. But I want to also just emphasize that I think it's really important that we don't we need also strong climate policy simultaneously. And that's where I think, as Bilal was saying, youth activists are so powerful, especially when we work in intergenerational ways, where we work with adult allies. And I keep hearing these stories of how young activists, it was them being outside City Hall when certain motions were put forward. And then there was everyone agreed because of that pressure of the youth activists outside. And so how we can sort of work as adult allies with youth activists to make sure that institutions are doing the responsive thing for this moment in time.
A good time to turn to questions from the audience. Maria, Bo, do you have, Mariah, sorry, do you have questions, please?
I do have a couple. The first one is, what can parents do to help the process?
Anyone want to come in on this?
I think we should turn to Bilal and ask that question.
What can parents
sure.
what can parents do to push this process further?
Definitely. Well, I think for the most part, I think as we were already talking about, so much of, I guess, the climate action information and knowledge comes from the students to their parents, right? So I think in terms of knowledge, I think actually the parents are the ones doing the more learning. However, I think what we need to see from parents is kind of this willingness to learn. I think that for some parents, I know I lived in an immigrant household, or I do live in an immigrant household. I don't know why I'm using past tense, but what we see, at least in a lot of families and from my friends and whatnot, is that some of our ideas there's always like a power dynamic, right? There's always a power dynamic between parents and their children, whereas, mother knows best, father knows best. But I think there needs to be a slight shift in that when it comes to climate education, where parents are genuinely interested in learning and hearing what it is that their students are learning from their schools, are learning from the internet, or from different sources, from the news. And when they come to them with a new idea, or let's start using different methods of recycling, let's start using less water, here are ways that we can implement these small changes into our household, I think they should be listening to that and trying their best to really switch that mindset that I think so many of us already grew up with, in terms of it's too late, or maybe just doing the bare minimum in terms of fighting against climate change. And so I think, to answer the question in simple terms, I think just listening to what the children have to say, and then making sure that that listening does end up going somewhere and just doesn't fall flat after it comes in.
I'd like to add one more to that too, is I think one of the best things we can do as parents is take our children and help them to develop relationships with the natural world. So instead of positioning us as separate from nature, we should be truly helping our young people and our children to understand that we are part of the natural world. It's a land-based approach, really, that is, many Indigenous knowledge keepers have given us instruction on, or we've been lucky to learn from them. Understanding that when we get children outside, even from very young ages, so starting with that baby in arms, walking out and introducing them to the smells, to the sounds, to the sensory experiences of being outside is really important. Getting them away from screen time is part of that, so that they can really have that firsthand experience. And as they grow older, helping them to understand the wonders of the world. It's so much easier, as David Orr has said, to connect our students to learn, to help them to learn to love the world when they're younger, and then they will want to help protect it as they get older. But without that firsthand experience, it's really tough to convince students that the world around them is part of us, and that we need to have relationships with it. They need that firsthand experience to do that learning.
I'll just add one more thing. Parents can also, elect school board trustees who are going to take this seriously and work to do what they can at their local school board level. So I think that's another sort of piece to consider, is how can you affect change as a parent within the school board that your child goes to school.
Mariah, another question, please.
Next question is, are there teaching techniques that work better for different age groups, preschool, elementary, high school, etc.?
Absolutely. Age appropriateness is really important here. And, Ellen had talked a little bit about this earlier. And it is a question, it's not really set in stone yet about what are age appropriate techniques. I think most of us would agree that taking an inquiry-based approach, helping students identify their questions, whether that's around climate, whether that's around the natural world, whether that's around whatever issues that they feel passionate about, helping them to identify how to not only figure out how to ask their questions, but also how to investigate and answer their questions, is an important general teaching strategy that can be used in any subject area and any field of study, but particularly works well as we don't have all the answers when it comes to climate change education. So that would be one example. But I'm a firm believer in helping children just get attached to their communities. So getting them outside, getting them to know both the built and the natural aspects of the communities in which they live. It's called place-based education. So rooting them in not what's happening halfway around the world, especially for the little ones. They don't really have clear connections to global issues and global context yet, but to really root it in the local. Because a child can understand that there's too much litter in their schoolyard and they don't like that. And they can actually be involved in helping to pick up that litter. And then, oh, so we did that on our schoolyard. Can we go and do that in the local park? So all of a sudden, their notion of agency can grow over time as their knowledge grows about these issues, and their sense of agency and activism grows. It's a really powerful piece to bring together as they get older, because then this results in young people like Bilal, who are doing some incredible activist work while they're still in secondary school. So that's what we want. We want students who are going to be active and engaged citizens as they really, truly start to embed themselves in the concerns and the issues of their communities.
And you all seem to have got strong on the message that a lot of power to get on with it is in an individual school right now. The head of the school, the teachers, meetings, the rest of it, a lot of power to get really involved in significant education, literacy, climate literacy is right there for the movement ahead right now.
And I think Hilary's point is really, really salient, because when we engage in our local communities in change-making processes, as Hilary pointed out, young people develop that sense of agency and activism. It also mitigates climate anxiety. And the thing with climate change too, is we were talking about, like, it's complex. The data is complex, the scale is complex. And so when we can bring it down to our local place, we can understand also the local impacts as well as local solutions. And so that just helps us really situate this huge, massive topic in a way that we can have direct relationship to it, and it becomes less overwhelming. And so I just think it's a really, really powerful way to think about it. And it's the appropriate way, because municipalities and cities are really in many ways at the forefront of change around climate. So there are so many important shifts that are happening at this scale. And so I think that's a place of engagement that's really, really powerful for schools to be thinking about, and moving the teaching and learning outside of those four walls and engaging directly in the community. So I really echo what Hilary said.
And Ellen, I'm going to add on one more pedagogical strategy here, and this is what you're talking about, is experiential learning. Yes. We quite literally want to get students' hands in the soil. We want them to connect in a whole variety of ways to their learning. And we want that to be not only responding to their cognitive senses, but also to their social emotional aspects of learning. We want it to be embodied learning, where they're using their bodies. Not only does that broaden our ways that we can connect with all of our students and help them feel included, but it really does empower them to understand that they can be really actively engaged and learning at the same time. That learning is not just sitting at a desk with a piece of paper, which sadly in far too many classrooms, that's what happens. I think most of us as adults really appreciate getting out and learning, whether that's on a walking tour of a park or whether that's canoeing down a river, that we learn lots from those experiences, and children and youth are just the same. Bilal, what's your favorite kind of learning when you're learning about climate change?
Definitely hands-on. Definitely not. Textbook is reserved for theories, but when you want to learn something, I definitely echo Hilary in terms of experiential learning is the way to go.
One of the things I want to bring up is that the country has to know what the educational system is doing in terms of climate change. We need to be well informed. Are we well informed? I want to bring up the media and its situation, and the media is always anxious to hear criticism. And I wondered if you might help it along by, where do you think, or do you think, the media actually does not efficiently cover education and climate change and what's going on in the schools? I've heard many a complaint that the media is interested in conflict, it's interested in crisis, but it's not interested in what They sometimes sneer. I'm saying they. It used to be me, amongst them as well, of course, as a former journalist, but not interested as much as they used to be in long ago in the process stories, how things get done, how departments work, how education systems actually create new things and start new things. They're much more interested in the conflict and the crisis coverage. Do you get that sense at all, or am I being too harsh on my own profession?
When I think of the media's involvement, I think of Earth Day. That's when we see news crews going into schools for a setup to see what the positive stories are around Earth Day. But the reality is that this work is happening year round. So where are the news crews, where are the media outlets covering the positive stories that children and youth are working on in schools every month of the year? And this is one of the challenges I think right now is that I completely agree with you, Brian, that the crises grab the attention. But we need to change that narrative. And the whole field of environmental communications has been doing a lot of work on this area recently, that we've tried scaring people into change, into behavioral change when it comes towards sustainability, and it doesn't work. We can give them all the information in the world. It doesn't work. What we really need to do is model how we can change the ways that we're living moving forward. And certainly sharing success stories from what's happening in education can be one way to do that.
That's it. Sorry, go ahead, Ellen.
Sorry, Brian. I really echo what Hilary is saying there, and I think Ellen Kelsey, a Canadian author who wrote the book Hope Matters, talked about this as a problem identification gap, that we're often stuck in reporting and also our thinking. I mean, I'm a researcher and I get funding by identifying the problem identification gap. But I think that there's something very salient in recognizing this focus on that. And so while in the last few months, I think there has been more reporting on education in Canada around climate, but it has still been with this lens of the problem identification gap on the deficits. And the stories of the amazing things that are happening in schools are not being told. They're actually really hard to come across. And so I think it's the shift in reporting that's really needed. And sort of following Ellen Kelsey, and she really tipped me onto this, there's a whole network of journalists called the Solutions Journalism Network. So they really look at how to do solutions orientation, reporting, recognizing this pervasive sort of aspect of journalism that always is stuck in the identification gap. And then I'll just name a few others. So the Grist has the Beacon, which is really about like solutions oriented newsletter. And CBC, I think, has also been responding with their What on Earth newsletter to really sort of address how to be responsive in terms of reporting, in terms of telling some of those solutions and good news stories. But good news environmental stories are like so minimal in terms of the proliferation of news stories. So we do get this saturation of doom and gloom when we.
That's actually been a general problem since I really think the 70s, and it's been growing for a long time. There's been excellent reporting. Some of the best reporting ever done has been done now, but there tends to be an emphasis on what doesn't work more than what does work. Mm-hmm. And the problem with that, not just education, but right through society, whether it be business or whether it be government departments, you name it, the health system, is that the public begins to doubt more and more that governments actually do anything or does any good. And people become more attracted to the extremes and more inclined to listen to various maybe conspiracy theories. You have it. So I think there is a general trend in the media to try and rediscover the benefits of positive, honest positive reporting. And I'm glad to see it's starting to make some degree of advance. But in this particular area, it'd be nice to see a lot more of it. I wanted to ask you, we're very short of time, so I'll ask for one more question. Mariah Bao, could you give us another question?
Are movements like eliminating plastic straws considered performative environmentalism, and what steps can folks take to move beyond that?
Could you repeat that? I didn't get that clearly, sorry.
Are movements like eliminating plastic straws considered performative environmentalism, and what steps can folks take to move beyond that?
So something basic like taking a plastic straw and eliminating it. It seems like a basic step, but is it part of that great solution, which we all agree is vastly complex and extraordinarily broad? Anyone want to talk on that?
Yeah, I think I can jump in first. So I think this is actually, it's quite funny that this question is brought up because there was this huge trend years ago, way before the pandemic, where the idea of save the turtles, it was kind of like save the turtles and, you know, stop using plastic straws. And it kind of eventually became this joke of, I guess, our generation, where people would say save the turtles when you see people making very marginal, I guess, environmental action. And so I guess the way I think about it is that stuff like eliminating plastic straws or just making sure that you're recycling more than what you currently are doing, I think they can be used as gateways, right? They can be used as introductions to what environmental action really looks like. And, you know, starting to get that one step into leading a, you know, waste-free lifestyle, for example. And so I think stuff like that, the very small, I guess what most would consider performative actions, is a really great gateway into other conversations about climate action. It's a good way to really start engaging yourself into what it means to be, you know, environmentally conscious and whatnot. But I think that it does reach a point where if that's all that we're doing, like especially when it comes to governments or it comes to corporations, a lot of corporations have moved from plastic straws to cardboard straws, which is another joke in itself because people are like, they melt the moment it touches your drink. And so I think there is a line where it starts to become performative, especially when it's all that you are doing. And so I think if it really depends on the context, right? If you're using it as some sort of introduction or a gateway into what it is that you could actually be doing, and then taking that time to learn, inform yourself, and take action on things that genuinely matter, I think it's a great way. Or I don't even consider it performative in that sense. But however, if it's corporations and governments or even individuals who kind of you know, just hit that barrier after eliminating plastic straws, I think that's when it's safe to say that yes, it is performative, and it's relatively dangerous to kind of think that you're doing the most for the environmental action movement when in reality you're just not drinking out of a plastic straw.
As
Well,
we,
that was such a great answer. And I have to tell you that I think both Ellen and I are going to be competing for you to come back into our Masters of Education programs when you're done. But I will add that, and this is, you talked about this notion of using the straw as a gateway, and you're so right about that, because something as simple as a straw, when we start digging backwards about how many people and how many resources were involved in creating that straw and shipping it to the location that a consumer picks it up, and then also tracking its path into that turtle's belly, maybe, or certainly into floating in the ocean, and how we're going to address that problem. All of a sudden, what has become a very small performative task becomes a really rich learning task, in fact, when you start looking at the broader context. And you can do that with anything. That's one of my favorite activities to do with my students, who will bring a disposable coffee cup into class. Okay, so let's have a conversation about that full life cycle of that disposable coffee cup. And all of a sudden, you can connect learning across the entire curriculum to the straw, to the coffee cup, to whatever item it is that you happen to be analyzing. And if that's the starting point, and if it's especially if it's your students who have brought in the idea, they deserve a fair examination of their idea. But let's use it as a starting point rather than the end. And this is exactly what you've just suggested. So fantastic.
I love that often when Hilary and I speak, we get into this like recruiting piece for universities. But I agree, Bilal and Hilary, in terms of that. And I think the only other point I would make is I love the framing on the gateway. I just think sometimes in climate action, we get confused around what are environmental actions and then what are climate actions. And sometimes I've done workshops with teachers and we'll sort of talk about climate change and all these things. And we'll say, okay, what are we going to do? Like, what is the school project we're going to do? And they go, we're going to recycle better. And so there's always this moment of kind of going, okay, right, we need to backtrack and think about what are effective climate actions that our school can do versus what are environmental actions that we are going to engage in, and sort of to delineate that a little bit and build some thinking around it, because schools really love recycling. It's been super effective, and I don't want to diminish that, but we've got pretty good systems in place. And so when we then think about how schools are going to be taking on climate action projects, we're going to move away from things like straws, but I don't want to diminish that either,
Right.
because I think the straw campaign has actually been incredibly effective in terms of how fast it's grown and its uptake. So I think there's learning there too.
Well, so you want to keep that climate target right in view at all times. As we close, I was wondering about something. This whole series has been set against the backdrop of education in the time of pandemic. We've lived through 2 years, really almost now, of very damaging times. A lot of setbacks, a lot of damage, a lot of hurt, but also, as often happens in almost all crises, there have been moments of new reflection, new thought, new experimentation, perhaps. And I wondered if you have any concluding words of, did something change in us during the pandemic that helps us in a way to see other problems, I say the other monster problem of our time, climate change, and perhaps even clearer? I know we were obviously concerned about it before, but do we look at it slightly differently now that we've come through this long, awful pandemic? Wants to
I would
start?
argue, yes, absolutely. I think the pandemic has done an excellent job of flushing notions of injustice and inequity to the surface of our healthcare systems, certainly, of how our cities have been constructed and laid out, about public transport. So I think what it's done for me is it's really encouraged me to think about how we move forward to what many people have been calling a just recovery. And that's a recovery that's focused in a much broader foundation of justice and equity for all, not just for settlers on this land, not just for people who are white, not people who are economically privileged, that we need to really consider how we're going to build back better for everyone. And I think the pandemic has been really good at flushing those inequities to the surface.
Ellen, you feel the same, that it's somehow things have changed, and in some ways, very perhaps potentially vastly important ways for the better?
I think so. I think it's also built this sense of collective empathy, and also it's brought into the public consciousness the idea that governments can act in a crisis, and to see bold ambition in the face of something that is life-threatening and imminent. And it still seems like we're not quite there yet in terms of the level of natural disaster and impacts, but we're getting there. And I think we need to keep the activism strong. And I think that's the other piece that I'd like to bring forward, is that the youth climate justice movement, it isn't just a school strike. It has justice as central. And so I think the power of that organization and what we can learn, coupled with what we've been going through with COVID, are very, very powerful forces right now in the world, in terms of how we think what that just transition recovery is. And Kim Stanley Robinson, in his latest book, The Ministry of the Future, which I highly recommend because it's really sort of this speculative fiction into the future and what it will look like. We are in this transformative time where we are rebuilding every sector of society in terms of what it means to live with this climate altered future. And I think there's a lot of, Paul Hawken calls this purposeful joy. And I think it's exciting and terrifying, but I try to stay with the exciting and be around really smart youth like Bilal, who are so inspiring, and they have capacities that are really, really unique for this generation.
Bilal, I'll give you the last word then. Your generation in the time of pandemic. The good, the bad, and then how do we come out of this?
For sure. So to answer the COVID question and how the pandemic has really changed our mindsets, I think most of us had a bit too much time to think with ourselves. And so we started seeing the world in a completely different light. And through that, you have so many people, finally taking a stand to things that they've maybe just now have understood. But other than that, I think the big lesson that I think so many of us have learned is that it takes all of us, right? Whether the context be the pandemic or the climate action movement, it takes not a country, not a city, not a continent, but the entire world to be on board for actual meaningful change to be, set in stone. So I think when it comes to how the pandemic really has changed us, I think we all understand that now. We understand that maybe us specifically not using plastic straws might not be the world changing factor, but when we all come collectively and demand change, and when our governments partake in that, and when countries come together to form alliances, and when the whole world is finally on board in terms of, we are actually in a crisis, and it's a crisis that we need to do something about, and something about fast, I think that's when we're finally going to see change, and change that will stick around as we've desperately needed it to.
Very powerful concluding words. Thank you all very much indeed on the panel. It's been extremely interesting in this 4-part series to look at how things have changed during the pandemic within education, and very inspiring to see the new ideas coming, the new energy and the new commitment. Anyways, thank you all very much indeed, and thank you for watching, and good night.